Greetings, Mason Storm here. On today's episode, we're going to look at making some vanilla pudding. I think this is the easiest recipe for making vanilla pudding, and it's not much more difficult than it is to make instant pudding. So let us begin. Our ingredients are 1/4 cup of sugar, 3 tablespoons of cornstarch or flour. I'm using flour, I couldn't find the cornstarch. 1½ teaspoons of vanilla, 1/2 teaspoon of salt, 2½ cups of milk. Just gonna put the old saucepan on the stove top here, crank our heat up to medium, and then we're going to start adding our physical ingredients. So we're going to begin with our sugar and our flour, as well as our salt, which I guess is the majority of our ingredients. And then we're going to add our milk in kind of slowly, kind of dumping it in, and we're going to keep mixing it. It's important to mix the milk in while it's kind of cold, that way it doesn't all clump up and it mixes properly. It's very similar to making gravy. If you have your fluids hot and you add flour to it, it just clumps up and it doesn't really work well. It's the same thing with making pudding. Not all that different from gravy. They're both delicious anyway. So now this is when the process gets very mundane and simple. So all we're going to do is we're going to keep stirring this occasionally till we get it to a boil. Now one of the things you may want to do is just kind of crank the heat to get a boil quicker. And that's what I did, and I do not recommend doing it, because it's very easy to scorch the bottom of the pan with the milk. And once you have kind of cooked milk on the bottom of your pan, and then you're stirring it, and then you can get like kind of this like filmy layer inside of your pudding, and that's kind of gross. So patience is definitely a virtue when it comes to the creation of a fine quality pudding. And eventually, as time will move on, it will start to boil. And once it starts to boil, you want to turn the heat down so it's almost like a simmer, and then we're just going to cook it for another like 3 minutes or so. Now the thing to do too is once it starts to boil, then you can toss in your vanilla and then kind of stir that around. You don't want to overcook your vanilla, that's why I kind of added it a little bit later. The vanilla that I'm using is homemade as well, so it wasn't the strongest vanilla in the world. I probably could have used a little bit more of it. Either way, I thought it turned out pretty good. 3 minutes isn't exactly the longest amount of time, but when you're constantly stirring it, it sure feels a lot longer than it is. But it will pass. And as we continue to stir it, and as it continues to kind of cook down, it will start thickening up. And it won't be long till it's a nice thick pudding. Although it doesn't truly thicken up until you let it set, so don't expect it to be a pudding consistency while it's on the stovetop. It's not till we take it off of the stove and put it into a bowl and refrigerate it for X amount of time that it turns into a real thick, creamy pudding. I really like this style of pudding because it's so easy to make and it's so simple in its ingredients. The type that use eggs are a little bit more complicated because you can kind of scald the eggs and that can kind of be problematic. So for that reason, this type is a lot easier. So let's set that aside now, turn our heat off, let that sit there a couple minutes, and then we'll dump it into a bowl. Just like so. And I'm going to let this cool off on the countertop for a little bit, and then I'm going to move it into the fridge and let it kind of set for a couple hours probably. I think it sets fairly quick. I haven't really watched it or anything, but this is the type of recipe that's very easy to modify and change into different things. If you want chocolate flavored, add some cocoa powder. If you want to use honey instead of sugar, go for it. Why not? A lot of different ways you can kind of mix this up, but it's just kind of a good starting place, a good template as far as creating pudding goes. If you have any ideas or suggestions for crazy interesting puddings, leave them in the comments below. And if you like my content and like to see more of it, please like and subscribe. And until next time, stay awesome.